is a classic scary story. It's about a group of people in Scotland who go into this infamous cemetery in the middle of the night and they encounter something very bizarre, and amazingly they actually manage to get a photo of it. And so if you stick around till the end of this video, you will see that photo. Late one night in November of 1999, a 66-year-old minister named Colin Grant opened up the iron gates of a cemetery called Greyfriars Kirkyard. The cemetery was one of the oldest and most famous cemeteries in Edinburgh, Scotland. Now the cemetery was basically pitch black. However, there were a few old iron lanterns that lined the cobblestone path that cut through the cemetery. And so Colin pushed open these big gates and he stepped onto this path and he began walking. And on either side of him, for as far as he could see, were all these headstones, some of which dated back to the 1600s. And as he kept walking, he could see up ahead, even in the darkness, the huge Gothic-style church that sat right in the centre of the cemetery. Now, at first glance, this cemetery just kind of looked like a pretty typical old cemetery, albeit a pretty spooky one. But to Colin, he knew there was far more than just a graveyard here. Deep underground, in the cemetery below where all the people have been buried at their headstones, was basically another cemetery. There was like this mass burial pit that the cemetery had been built on top of. And in this lower level cemetery, which in no way was marked, this is basically a hidden mass burial where thousands of people who had been starved and tortured to death hundreds of years ago. And so Colin stopped for a second on the path, just kind of stared ahead of this church, and for a second he thought about just turning and leaving, because he did not want to be here. He was really only here because the city had begged him to come here. Colin, in addition to being a minister, claimed to be a psychic, which meant he could speak to the dead, and so the city, in desperation, had asked him to come to this cemetery tonight and perform an exorcism. And so, as much as Colin did just want to turn around and leave, he knew he really had a duty here. Not just to the city, but really to the people of the city, because if he didn't do this exorcism, there was a good chance more people were going to get hurt. The only thing that was making Colin a little bit less afraid in this moment was he actually was not alone in the cemetery. There were two people with him. There was a journalist and a photographer from a local newspaper who were basically tagging along to document this exorcism. And so, after taking a minute to compose himself, Colin continued walking deeper into the cemetery with these two following behind him. And then, before reaching the big church, Colin left the path and began cutting through the grass, passing by different headstones on the way to perhaps the most infamous building in the entire cemetery, the Black Mausoleum. The Black Mausoleum was this tall stone crypt with a rounded top that had been built sometime in the late 1600s. And as Colin got closer to this pretty creepy looking building that sat basically on the side of the cemetery, Colin began to feel this really intense sense of dread come over him. And the closer he got, that dread began to kind of manifest itself in like a pit in his stomach. And eventually he began feeling really scared of this building. And eventually Colin actually had to fully stop about 10 or so feet away from the building because he just felt like he couldn't go any closer. It felt evil. And then Colin turned and looked at his companions, the journalist and photographer, to see if maybe they were reacting to this mausoleum, but the two of them were just standing there with blank expressions on their face, like obviously not thinking that anything sinister was happening here. You know, even though the city had asked the minister to be here to perform this exorcism in this mausoleum, you know, it didn't mean everybody believed what was going on here. And clearly these two didn't. They were rightly sceptical, but this didn't offend Colin. He was used to people not believing in the things he believed in, and he knew as soon as he actually began his work, doing this exorcism, they would change their mind. And so, at some point, Colin told the photographer that, hey, I'm going to go in the mausoleum now because I have to do the exorcism before I do take a picture of the mausoleum. And so the photographer just raised her camera and took a picture of the mausoleum. Colin thanked her, and then he turned and began walking towards the building. And when he got right in front of it, he looked up and he read the name across the top of the crypt, and it said, George Mackenzie. And as Colin read that, he could feel his heart rate start to spike. So, back in the late 1600s, George Mackenzie was a Scottish lord who worked for the King of England, enforcing the king's religious laws. But at the time, these laws were very unpopular, and there was one group called the Covenanters who hated these laws so much that they actually mounted a full-scale rebellion in 1679. But their rebellion failed miserably, and this is when George Mackenzie came in. He captured over 1,000 Covenanters, and he marched them all into this huge field, which would later become the Greyfriars Kirkyard Cemetery. But at the time, it was just a big open field, and he held them there. And for weeks he had these people starved and tortured and mutilated, and if anybody tried to run or resist because they knew they were doomed, they all knew they were going to die here. If anybody he took off, he would capture them, cut their head off, and then place their head on a spike around the perimeter of this field until after several weeks, the entire field is just ringed with decaying bodies and bloody heads on spikes. And so, after a few months of this, basically everybody in that field had been murdered in some horrible way by George Mackenzie, and their bodies were all dumped into a mass grave in Greyfriars Courtyard, then covered over. And then, hundreds of years later, a proper cemetery would be built right on top of that mass grave. And then, when George Mackenzie died later on, he lived a normal, happy, full life after doing all these horrible things. They built him this beautiful mausoleum in Greyfriars Kirkyard. And so here's this horrible person, George Mackenzie, who's a mass murderer, and he's put to rest in this beautiful mausoleum, just, feet away from this mass grave of all these people he killed. For almost 300 years after Mackenzie was buried, Greyfriars Kirkyard was quiet. It was not considered a haunted place. That all changed, though, in 1998. So that was 1 year before Colin showed up to perform this exorcism. That year, in 1998, a homeless man broke into the Black Mausoleum, and he fell through the floor and landed in one of those mass burial pits of those people Mackenzie had killed. And apparently, basically right after this happened, visitors to the cemetery began reporting the same thing, that any time they were in or near the Black Mausoleum, they'd get pushed or tugged on or scratched or burned or even strangled. People were coming out of the cemetery terrified, and so quickly people in town began to speculate about, what was going on in the cemetery, and quickly a story began to circulate around town that maybe when that guy fell through the floor in the mausoleum, that had released George Mackenzie's evil spirit, and his spirit was responsible for all these attacks. And so it went on like this for about a year, until finally this young woman was found outside of the Black Mausoleum, unconscious, looking like she'd been strangled. And when she came to, she had no memory of what happened. And so people assumed this had to be another attack by the spirit of George Mackenzie. And so by this point, the city was totally fed up with this. They didn't know what to do. And so they said, you know what, let's just try an exorcism. Let's have someone go into that mausoleum and literally confront the spirit of George Mackenzie and banish him, get him out of here and stop this madness. And so, ultimately, Colin was hired to perform this exorcism. As Colin stood there, reading the name George Mackenzie and mentally preparing himself to go inside of this horrible place, he realised he just couldn't do it. This was too much. And so Colin is just standing there feeling totally stressed out. He's embarrassed. He feels like a coward. He has no idea what he's going to say to the photographer and journalist who've literally come out here to document what he's going to do. And now he's not going to do it. But as Colin turned around to basically blurt out this really embarrassing news that, hey guys, we gotta leave, he realised he actually knew something else he could do that in many ways might actually be better than going into this mausoleum and doing an exorcism. And so, without saying anything, Colin just turned and began speed walking over to this big field that was not too far away from the Black Mausoleum. And when he got there, he just began chanting prayers and walking in circles, flicking holy water. Didn't explain anything he was doing to the journalist and the photographer who'd followed him over there and are just watching him, like, what's going on here? They got no idea. He's not clarifying. And for hours, this is what he did. He just kind of paced in this field, just kind of doing what looked like stereotypical, exorcism type behaviour. And that's what the journalist and the photographer assumed he was doing. And so, as Colin did whatever he was doing in this field, the photographer, whose name was Susan Burrell, just began doing her job, again, thinking that he was doing the exorcism. And so she just started taking pictures of him. And then finally, around 2 a.m, so again, this has been hours of Colin doing this thing he's doing, Colin just abruptly stops and walks over to Susan and the journalist. And Colin looks horrible. He's totally haggard. His hair is all dishevelled, he's sweating, he's pale, and his head is down. And he says to the two women, I failed. He explained to them that his original intention was to go into the Black Mausoleum and confront George Mackenzie's spirit head-on and banish him from the cemetery. However, he'd had a change of heart at the door and decided to go this other route, which was to go to this big open field in the middle of the cemetery and attempt to free the spirits of all those Covenanters who had been tortured and killed by George Mackenzie. Colin's thinking was, if I can free all of these poor, tortured souls, that maybe, once they're gone, George Mackenzie's spirit will also go away. And while, according to Colin, he was able to free, 200, some odd trapped souls, he said there were many more that still needed to be freed. And he just didn't have the strength, like he couldn't do this right now. And so he said, I have to rest and do this at another time. Now, the journalist and the photographer were totally over this and did not care at all. It's 2 a.m. They don't really understand what he was doing. They don't really know if this was the exorcism or if it was something else. But to them, they're like, okay, fine, we'll get out of here. It's late. It's not a big deal. And so, the three of them, they began walking out of the cemetery. And right when they got in front of the church, so basically between where the Black Mausoleum was and where that field was, where Colin had been for the past several hours, Colin abruptly stopped. And he told the journalist and the photographer that actually, you know what? He had a little strength left. And he felt like it was his duty to try this again, because he knew he could free more souls, and so he was going to give it another go. And so the journalist and the photographer are like, okay. And so Colin, he gets out his Bible and he begins kind of doing the same thing he was doing out in the field, walking around, chanting Bible verses, spraying holy water all around. And then, at some point, for reasons he did not explain to either Susan or the journalist, he pulled out 12 candles from his backpack that he had brought along, and he put them in a circle on the ground right in front of this church. It also encompassed this big Celtic cross that was on the ground, and Colin was inside of the circle, and he lit all these candles, and the whole time again, he's chanting out these Bible verses, and he stands up, and right after all the candles have been lit, suddenly Susan and the journalist noticed that the candles begin to flicker, and it's not windy at all inside the cemetery, like they shouldn't be flickering, and at the same time, Colin seemed to sense that something was happening around him, and he turned his whole body, his whole presence, and he looked over at the black mausoleum and began chanting these Bible verses louder and louder, like he was aiming them at the black mausoleum. And as he was doing this, the candles were flickering more and more and more, and at some point, Colin actually picked up one of these candles and kind of held it out at the black mausoleum. And so, at this point, the journalist and the photographer, Susan, they're sensing that something weird is happening here. Like, this is spooky what they're seeing. Like, why are the candles flickering? What's going on with Colin? Like, what's happening here? And for a minute, the two of them kind of abandoned their actual job, which is to document what they're seeing. And they just stood there kind of witnessing this totally bizarre event. But then, Susan sort of broke out of it. She lifted up her camera, and right as Colin is passionately chanting out these verses, she takes a picture of him. And the second she does, the flash lights up the cemetery. And then after the flash goes away, Colin, it was like the light went out on him, and he just crumpled to the ground. And so the journalist immediately ran over to Colin to see if he was okay. And Colin, who's like barely conscious at this point, he just kept repeating, "This is going to kill me. This is going to kill me." And so Susan was about to run over and join her colleague and make sure Colin was okay. But before she did, she glanced down at her camera to see the picture she had taken of Colin right before he collapsed. And as she glanced at it, she couldn't believe what she was looking at. At first she thought, maybe this is some trick of the light, like this can't be right. But then she zoomed in on the photo, and when she looked closely, she screamed. Here's the photograph that Susan took. As you can see, Colin, the minister, is standing there with the candle outstretched, and behind him is the big church, and on the church on the left side, there are windows. Now, this church was locked up. Nobody was inside the church at the time, but you can clearly see in the left window, there is a figure in that window looking out at Colin. Now, of course, this is not evidence enough to make everybody believe that, that must be George Mackenzie's spirit staring out at Colin. He's the reason Colin collapsed. But I'll tell you, this photograph is not the end of the story. Remember, after Colin collapsed to the ground after this photo was taken, the journalist ran over, and all Colin kept saying was, "This is going to kill me. This is going to kill me." Well, it would turn out he'd be right. Not long after this failed exorcism, Colin would die inexplicably. His death would come as a total shock to his friends and family. No one has ever been able to debunk the photo that Susan took that showed that dark figure in the window of the church, meaning nobody knows what that was. The church really was supposed to be empty and locked, and so how is there somebody or something in the window? Nobody knows. A lot of people think that could be the evil spirit of George Mackenzie, striking, calling down, and Susan managed to capture it on film. But, it's up to you if you believe that or not. But I will say to this day, people go into that cemetery and come out with scratch marks on them, and, claiming they were pushed or pulled or strangled, and so that cemetery is considered to be one of the most haunted places in the world, and George Mackenzie's spirit, who supposedly haunts it, is considered to be one of the most dangerous poltergeists in the world as well. Dylan's diary. Someone we didn't know tried to pick Dylan up from school today, said his elementary teacher. The guy said he was Dylan's older brother. Dylan doesn't have a brother, I said, alarmed. We thought so too, replied the teacher. I suspected something wasn't right straight away. It was this tall, lanky guy with black hair. Looked in his late 30s, maybe even 40. He knew your address, Dylan's full name and birthday, and which class he was in. I went inside to check with the principal. When I came back out, the guy was gone. I was silent for a second as I stood facing the teacher outside the school gate. The gate separated the main road and a large playground and basketball court leading into the school. All the other kids and parents had left, and we were the only ones standing outside. Where's Dylan now? I asked. He's waiting for you in the principal's office, she said, gesturing for me to follow as she turned around. I walked across the playground behind her shakily, then through the corridors to the office. My 8-year-old son, Dylan, sat on the couch in the principal's office, still as a stone. The principal sat behind her desk, and there was a cop standing next to her. Hey buddy, I said, you okay? Dylan looked at me blankly. My Dylan was always a quiet boy. It was just the two of us at home at the time. I was a single dad. My late wife Angie, Dylan's mother, died a year prior. She'd been hit by a car while cycling around a sharp bend, and they never identified the driver. I won't go into any more detail here, as frankly I'd rather not relive that period, but safe to say it destroyed me. I tried to pick up the pieces and stay strong for Dylan. Was I doing a good job? Only God knows. I received no feedback. Since then, Dylan became even more withdrawn, pretty much remaining silent until spoken to. He was seen by a child psychologist and various other members of the welfare team at school, but after assessment, they were sure he didn't have autism or the like. He could speak up when he was pressed. He was just shy and preferred to keep to himself. The cop confirmed I was Dylan's dad, then asked me a few questions. He finally told us they'd try and find the guy and to report if we ever saw him again. The principal and teacher said a few things. It was a blur. All I remember is sweating profusely, with my knees shaking, trying to comprehend the fact that someone had tried to kidnap my son. Dylan, you didn't know that man, did you? Asked the principal. Dylan shook his head. I was on edge after that day. Dylan was my whole world, all the family I had left, and I couldn't stand the possibility that he could be in danger. It made me sick. Who was this bastard? Why my son? Did he know us, or was it some random creep? I always walked Dylan to and from school thereafter, and was never late to pick him up again. Meanwhile, Dylan himself didn't seem rattled in the slightest. He never mentioned the incident unless specifically asked. At the time, I thought he was just timid and didn't want to cause trouble. A couple of weeks later after the incident, the same homeroom teacher called me during her lunch break. She said one of the kids in her class saw Dylan talking to a man through the school fence. When she rushed out, the man was gone. When Dylan was asked about it, he said he hadn't been talking to anyone. The girl who apparently spotted him was questioned further, and she was adamant she saw Dylan talking to a tall, lanky man with messy black hair. The cops were called again, did a quick search of the perimeter of the school, but they found no one suspicious. That afternoon, I sat Dylan down at the kitchen table. I won't get angry, I just need you to tell me the truth, I said, trying to steady my nerves. Did you or didn't you talk to a stranger today at school? Yes or no? He shrugged. Getting an answer out of him was harder than drawing blood from a stone. How many times have we told you not to talk to strangers? It's for your own safety. You do understand that, don't you, son? He nodded, looking slightly afraid. I realised I had raised my voice and felt guilty immediately. Exasperated and running on 2 hours of sleep, I left him at the dining table and went straight to bed. That night, I woke at 2 a.m. and went for a bathroom trip. I decided to check on Dylan while I was at it. He wasn't in his room. I called out his name and looked around in the living room and kitchen, getting more frantic as the seconds ticked by. I checked wardrobes, corners, even in cupboards, which made no sense to look in as he'd never fit in them. But I was desperate, thinking he'd been kidnapped. I went out into the street, yelling his name as I ran up and down it like a maniac to no avail. As I came back into the house ready to call the police, I looked in Dylan's room for one last check. He was sitting up on his bed, wide awake and staring back at me. "Where were you?" I asked, relieved but still alarmed. "I was here," he replied. "No, you weren't. I was looking everywhere for you, and you weren't in here." I was. Had I imagined all of that? I shook my head, feeling a migraine coming on. "Just stay in your room, okay? Don't scare me." I thought my eyes had deceived me somehow, and the paranoia was getting to me. Perhaps I should have paid attention to the fact that the window was wide open. About a year after those incidents, I heard a knock at my apartment door. I was inside doing some paperwork while Dylan was in his room playing Minecraft. I was on alert immediately. No one ever knocked on the door. We lived in a block of apartments, and friends or acquaintances would always wait outside the main door, ring the doorbell, and I would greet them downstairs. This meant it was likely an upstairs or downstairs neighbour who needed something. I had a few of their numbers from when we moved in, for contact should the need ever arise, but we weren't close at all. I wondered what could be the problem. I walked up to the door and looked outside the peephole. There was no one there. Odd, I thought. Perhaps I'd heard something. Those random occurrences were commonplace now, and second-guessing myself was just in my nature at that point. As I walked back to my desk in the living room, I heard another knock. Something was up. I walked up to the door again. No one seen through the peephole. Was someone pranking us? I stood just behind the door and texted my upstairs neighbour, asking him if he'd knocked on the door. A few moments later, I heard footsteps upstairs that went in the direction of the door, then hurriedly back into the apartment. I then received a text back, about a minute later. "Do not open the door. There's a guy with a huge knife crouching, hiding right next to your door." My phone buzzed again. Another text from my upstairs neighbour. "Calling cops. RN. Stay inside." I froze as all the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I was paralysed for a few seconds. When I came to my senses, I tiptoed to Dylan's room. "Stay inside. Keep quiet," I whispered, my eyes bulging, beads of sweat dripping down my forehead. I had never felt my heart beat so fast. Dylan looked up and raised his eyebrows as I shut his door slowly and stood outside it, about to throw up and shit myself at the same time. We were so still that I could make out quiet but frantic talking upstairs, and more rushing footsteps. I read my upstairs neighbour's texts again to make sure my eyes hadn't deceived me. I tiptoed to the kitchen and grabbed one of my own kitchen knives, then returned to the same spot outside Dylan's room, anticipating a crazed psycho busting down the door at any second. I chanted manic prayers for safety on repeat in my head. Not a sound came from inside his room. After what seemed like years, I heard sirens in the distance, and my heart rate started to slow a little. My grip on the knife handle loosened. Eventually I heard some shouting, more footsteps and banging that gradually faded in volume. "This is the police," shouted a voice. I looked through the peephole to confirm that it was a cop, then opened the door was waiting for someone inside to open it. He was indeed waiting with a freshly sharpened knife. What was he going to do with it to the first person who opened that door, which was going to be me? Well, if it isn't obvious, then your guess is as good as mine. This guy's name was Gregory. He seemed to bounce around from place to place with no permanent address, even travelling between states and doing petty crimes like theft, harassment, and occasionally stalking minors. When they did a more thorough search, it turns out he had been involved in at least one gruesome murder in a different state and ended up being given a life sentence for it, along with his accomplices. I wouldn't have wished that terror upon anyone, but these unfortunate things happen. The side effects of the psychological damage I experienced that day have never left me. However, I know people who have been through similar horrors, but never lived to tell the tale, so I looked on the bright side and counted myself lucky. Where there are sick freaks, there will be victims. The sicko was in jail, and I thought that was the end of it. But there was a different side to the story that I only uncovered 10 years after the incident. Dylan was due to leave for college, living away from home for the first time. He had grown into a tall kid with a surprising number of friends, still obedient, but relentlessly quiet. While packing his things and clearing out his room, I found a rugged-looking old notebook at the back of his bottom drawer. "Dylan's diary," said the cover. I flicked through it with no intention to pry initially, and saw that he had written and drawn in it extensively, with impressively neat handwriting. He had always been a boy of few words, so I was intrigued. I began reading from the first page. Page 1. Cody's house, 11 a.m. He has to give me back my coat. There were a few stick figure drawings. Page 2. I need a book for English class next week. Ask if Amy has one. I turned the pages, and the first few were filled with the same mundane elementary school day-to-day affairs, mixed in with a few doodles. Then I got to page 21. Page 21. Why does my dad talk so much? He won't even let me get an Xbox, and he won't let me sleep over at Cody's house. Talking back is no use. I hate him. I felt a sting, and my heart sank. I remembered that day vividly, and a pang of guilt ran through me. I turned the page. Page 22. Saw Greg today. He says he can help me get rid of Dad. I said he was lying, but he says he's done it before. It was in the news. As my mind connected the dots, I flicked through the previous pages. This was the first mention of Greg I could find. I started to sweat, but continued reading. Page 23. Me and Greg are coming up with a plan. Need Dad gone. But I almost got caught talking to him today. Mrs. Watford, that stupid old mole rat, kept asking me. She took me to the principal's office again. I think Katie saw Greg and snitched. Need to be careful. A few blank pages, with a few in between, filled with scribbles and admin-type notes to self. Then the narrative continued. Page 41. The word plan was underlined, with 2 drawings underneath. The first was of a stick figure kneeling by a door, holding what looked like a dagger. This stick figure was smiling. There was another stick figure behind the door, with its hand on the door handle, about to open the door. The second was of the first stick figure stabbing the stick man, who had just opened the door, his eyes now 2 crosses. Page 42. Greg came to my house and I showed him my plan. He said it was good and he could do it. We almost got caught by Dad, but I got back in bed just in time. He's going to get some tools from his house. Close 1. Page 43. Greg screwed up. He's in jail now. Why did Dad not open the door when Greg knocked? Everything went wrong. I don't know why. Page 44. I wish my dad would just shut up. I flicked through the rest of the notebook, which was blank. Page 44 was the last entry. I read the entries a few times and pondered what I should do. I never thought Dylan was capable of such heinous intentions. Confused and upset, I acted as if nothing had happened for a few days, but on the day he was due to leave for college, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I brought his duffel bag down and hooked it on his suitcase. He was ready to head to the station, standing outside the door with the suitcase and his backpack. Dylan, when you were younger, did I ever say or do anything that hurt you? You can be honest with me. No, why do you ask? He replied. I held up the diary. He froze for a second, and I saw the colour drain from his face. I won't blame you for anything, don't worry. You know I love you very much, son. You were a minor, and you were a victim of a very sick man. Besides, this thing is years old. I just want to know what I did wrong at the time to lead to this, and we can put it behind us. His shocked expression faded, leaving his ever-present blank stare. You didn't do anything wrong. Neither did Mum. I opened my mouth to ask him what he meant by that, but stopped. The corners of his mouth stretched into a wide smile. Our eyes met, and we stood in silence for a few seconds. Dylan, if I were to find another one of these notebooks, I began tactfully, would I see the blueprint of my wife's murder inside? Yeah. He didn't even pause to answer. Then he gripped the handle of his suitcase and walked off down the street. That was 2 years ago now. I never forgave him. Every night I still lie awake thinking whether he was born that way, or it's somehow my fault. We haven't talked since he left that day, and he hasn't come back home. He's never tried to contact me, and I haven't likewise. It looks like he's doing well in college from his Facebook posts. He seems to have a lot of friends, so I assume he got his own place, or stays with one of them. I wonder if any of them will